and welcome to another Plain Truth, and this week we're going to be talking about overspeed. Joining me, as always, is the legend that is Captain Al. Hi, Captain Al.
Hello to you, and thanks for having me back.
Now, listen, we've been contacted by one of our listeners, David Kavanagh, and he shared with me an article about overspeed. I'll give you a rough summary. Basically, it was a pilot trying to avoid overspeed led to a crew member breaking their leg, an ATSB report finds. And his question really was, what is overspeed, and how would that cause something like what we read in this article?
Okay. So this is aerodynamically quite a complex question, so we'll keep it fairly straightforward. So when an aeroplane is flying, there are an area where it's basically of speed that it's safe to fly. If you become below this speed, then aerodynamically the wing will stall. So it's not an engine stall, it's not like your car engine stalling. It just in simple terms mean that the wing is no longer producing lift.
Right.
And it is the lift that keeps the aeroplane in the sky. So basically the air over the surface of the wing isn't traveling fast enough to produce the lift to keep the weight of the aircraft in the sky. Now, it gets a bit complex because it's all to do with angle of attack rather than speed. And you will hear angle of attack or alpha mentioned from time to time. And that is the critical thing rather than speed, because speed varies with weight, whereas the alpha is a much more simplistic scale to determine, but actually quite complex in detail. At the other end of the spectrum, if an aeroplane goes too fast, then it will start to experience other undesirable aerodynamic effects. So quite clearly at the low end of the spectrum, if the aeroplane goes too slow and falls out of the sky, that's not good. At the high speed end, as we get faster and faster and we start to approach supersonic speed, in an aeroplane that's not designed to go supersonic, undesirable aerodynamic effects start to happen. And this was kind of experienced, Captain Nick might correct me on this, but sort of during the Second World War, when pilots were starting to get things like Spitfires near supersonic speed in the descent. So they were diving down, getting towards supersonic speed, and the aeroplane was sort of pitching more and more forward, despite the fact that they wanted to pull out of the dive, and the aeroplane would just go straight into the ground. So we're not going to get into heavy aerodynamics, but there is a relatively small speed range for which the aeroplane should be safely operated. So if you overspeed the aeroplane, which is most likely to happen in the descent, and indeed this was the case with the Virgin Australia, crew were asked by air traffic control to keep a high rate of descent, a high speed up. And as the aeroplane started to approach the upper end of the safe speed regime, so it was approaching the overspeed,
Right.
the autopilot would deal with this. However, in this particular case, the captain felt that the autopilot wasn't dealing with it, and he felt the need to intervene. Pause, semicolon, new paragraph. Matt, are you a roller coaster kind of person?
Me personally, no, I can't think of anything worse, I have to be honest. I'm
Right.
more of a...
I thought that might be the case. Have you ever been on one?
Yes, I have, mostly under duress and being forced by my now ex-friends. But yes,
Right.
I have been on one.
So I want you to, without too much trauma, imagine, your bog standard sort of Big Dipper light roller coaster. So you trundle up to the top of the hill,
Yep.
and then you go down the hill, and usually then you go back up a hill, yeah?
Yeah.
So as you're going downhill quite fast, and you reach that point where the roller coaster is starting to climb back up again, can you remember what happens to your body when that's happening?
Well, I mean, it's sort of thrown all over the place. It's that lurching feeling, isn't it, as it switches from
so
going down to going up.
as the roller coaster starts to go back up the hill, you start to encounter positive G. So you're forced back down into your seat, aren't you?
Yes.
So when the captain decided to intervene by pulling out of the dive, as it were, that's exactly what he did. He introduced quite a large amount of positive G. And with it being a 737, so conventional no fly-by-wire, the harder you pull, more G. And that's unfortunately what caused the cabin crew member to become unstable on his or her feet, thereby breaking the leg. So his fear was overspeeding the aeroplane, which is justified. What he did, we're not going to question his actions, if you like. But what he was preventing is the aeroplane overspeeding, because we don't want to take it into the area called transonic, which is the transition into supersonic, because we just don't want the aeroplane to go into that unstable state where it would probably start to nose further forward. So regardless of the fact that you're pulling back, it's almost like the controls are reversed and the aeroplane is going further and further nose down.
Oh, wow.
And that's not nice.
No, absolutely. And obviously potentially very catastrophic.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we have various indications on the flight deck to alert us of this. So as we're talking about an old-style aeroplane like the 737, at the low end of the speed scale, as we approach that point where the wing starts to aerodynamically stall, we have a couple of things. So we have a stick shaker. So the yoke will actually be physically shaken by a mechanical motor. So that's an alerting device. And then if we still haven't actually rectified the speed issue, eventually something called stick push will kick in, which will actually physically push the stick forward. The idea being, of course, that if you push the nose forward or push the stick forward, the nose will go down, thereby increase the speed and stop the aerofoil from stalling. At the other end of the speed scale, at the high speed scale, we have something called the barber's pole. It's a red and white pointer on the airspeed indicator. Now, depending on your altitude, determines where that pointer is. So it's a movable feast, if you like. So this is where it gets a bit complicated, because the higher you go, the less in knots the airspeed indicator will read, but then you start to get into Mach numbers. But basically, wherever you happen to be, there will be this red and white pointer. Now, aeroplanes need to operate at the highest altitude possible for efficiency, and the higher we go, the thinner the air gets. So therefore, there's less air to hold us up, if you like. And because of that, the gap between our lowest safe speed and our highest safe speed is relatively small. And it's an area called coffin corner, because the higher you go, the smaller the margins get. Now, right. It may well be that the gap between low speed and high speed is only, 10 or 15 knots. So there isn't a lot of speed to play with up there.
No.
Now, it may be necessary to be up that high because you might need to be up there because of other traffic or weather beneath you. But if you're encountering any turbulence at high altitude, you may want to descend to increase the margin between your low speed and your high speed.
Wow. Again, lots of really interesting elements to this for me. And so really, does the autopilot occasionally get it wrong then? I'm not quite sure why he would take it out of autopilot.
So in answer to your question, it's an interesting one. A lot of us have got used to having cruise control on our cars. And then in recent years, we've had adaptive cruise control, where the car will use some form of radar to monitor the gap between you and the car in front. So even though we've set, say, for example, 70 miles an hour on the cruise control, if we're catching the car or vehicle in front of us up, we will start to slow down automatically to maintain that gap.
Yeah.
Now, I had a car that did that, and it would control the speed all the way down to a safe stop. Now, it takes a lot of courage of conviction to sit there as you're approaching a stationary traffic jam ahead and allow the car to come to a stop, knowing full well that it's going to judge the distance quite accurately.
Yeah, having full faith in the equipment, essentially, yeah.
Yeah. So the key thing here is, like any other piece of automation, it can go wrong. So if you think that it's not doing what it should do, the golden word is intervene. How you intervene is very much a function of where you've got yourself into. So if you think that the greatest risk is the aeroplane going transonic and then, diving spectacularly, uncontrollably to the ground, then maybe your best strategy is to pull out of that dive. Everybody's kind of squashed into their seats and you have a small amount of collateral damage. So, yes, just like any other piece of technology, it can go wrong. And as you push it to the limits, if you like, then potentially the time that you have to assess whether it is doing what it's supposed to do or not becomes less.
Yeah.
So the way that you descend the aeroplane sometimes can be quite close to the high-speed awareness. Now, as you're coming down into thicker air, you're less worried so much about going supersonic as you were, because that's not really going to happen, because the lower down you get, the less likely that is in a passenger transport aircraft. So that's not really the risk. It's just generally bits flying off the aeroplane because it's not designed to go that fast. But the big consideration close to the ground is hitting something. So we talked in a previous episode about wildlife strikes. So the faster you're going, the more damage something will do if you hit it.
Right, yes. Basic rule of thumb, as they say. Well,
yes, and it's exponential. It's a factor of 2. It's not a linear thing. It's exponential, so it's a factor of 2. So
absolutely. Well, Al, thank you very much for covering that subject, and hopefully, David, you have all the answers there that you need. But for now, Captain Al, thank you.
It's a pleasure.